Thank you all so much for being here and for welcoming me here. I've been looking forward to this visit for several months since I met Nate and a couple other Sattler folks at a talk in March here in Boston, and I'm just really pleased to be here. I also have heard such great things about Sattler from my colleague now at Duke, Aaron Griffith, who used to teach here for a while and speaks really highly of. Do you know Dr. Griffith? Is he excellent? Very good. Okay, well, I will tell him that you send greetings. It's really great to be here, and now that I'm here on your campus, I don't know how you get any work done with the views that are out of these windows. So I think that's what I would be doing if I were here. So you all are much more disciplined academically than I have ever been. I'm really excited to be here. The way we're going to structure it today is I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking a bit about my own story and about how I think about the integration of faith and mental health care. Then Nate and I are going to be in conversation with each other, and then we'll just be in conversation with all of us. So this is meant to be me giving a few thoughts that then we'll be in conversation about. That's my hope today. Just so I know who's in the room, I've heard a little bit about like how people get to Sattler and what brings you here. How many of you are planning to be either in medicine or in some discipline of healthcare at some point after you graduate? Okay, great. Okay, good. So a good number in the room of pre-med, or I know pre-mental health, pre-psychology. I know some of you are interested in global work and mission work. And so it's really, I'd love to be able to think with you about like your own future in healthcare, but also for all of us are connected to healthcare in various ways, whether as patients or as loved ones or as family members or as those of you that might end up working in churches and faith communities. We all have a stake in the world of healthcare. So let's talk about that. I do want to bring greetings also from our work at Duke. At Duke, I have this kind of strange position where I teach both in the medical center as a professor in the psychiatry department, but also I get to teach at the Divinity School at Duke, which is how I know Dr. Griffith, and I co-direct something called the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative. And we're an initiative Duke is kind of an interesting place because it's got a Christian seminary in the middle of the large secular research university, and we get to do specifically Christian work. So we invite, in our theology, medicine, and culture work, we invite medical students and gap year students who've graduated from undergrad but are headed to a health profession school, and nurses and occupational therapists and others to come together to study with each other as Christians about how to connect faith and healthcare. We think of ourselves as contributing to the renewal of healthcare by forming the church's healthcare practitioners for faithful practice and public witness. And so if any of you are interested in that work, I'll pass around a clipboard that just gives you a chance to put your name and email on, and you can just sign up for our email list about once we have newsletters about once a month. If any of you are interested also in potentially doing a seminary degree or studying with us, I want to invite you to consider our residential theology, medicine, and culture fellowship, where you could come to Duke for 1 to 2 years to study with us in the Divinity School and to think about faith and healthcare. Or if you are interested, we also have a hybrid program where you can live anywhere, including Boston, and study with us for after you graduate from Sattler for a week in August and a week in January, and then for the rest of the year. So I just invite you to learn about our work. I put a few flyers back kind of near where the trash cans are in the back, near where the pizza is. And you're welcome to pick those up, and I'll just pass this around over the course of the time. Can I start in the middle? All right. Well, let me tell you a little bit about myself, and it's really great to be back in Boston, where I spent several years, and then we'll be in conversation together. I am originally from upstate South Carolina. Anybody from the Carolinas? Very good. I'm from Greenville. I'm not sure if any Greenville people here. Very good. I went to Furman University, which is a liberal arts college there. And then I ended up right after college here in Boston at Harvard Medical School. And I'd grown up a Christian. I was a Southern Baptist growing up. I came here to Boston as a Christian who had lived for my entire life in the South. And Boston was kind of a new world for me in many ways. And it was an amazing place to be a Christian. And I'd love to just hear from you all as you're thinking about your common work here at Sattler and also engaging in the larger city, like what that experience has been like for you. Boston was the first place that I'd lived where it wasn't like normative to be a Christian. It didn't feel like everybody around me was a Christian. There wasn't the assumption that I would be one. I was at Harvard just a few years after Dr. Kuravila was. but it was an amazing place. We had an amazing Christian community. And I found myself in medical school at Harvard, drawn to this like fairly small but really vibrant group of Christians who came from all over the world and represented a lot of different kinds of traditions. So in the South, I'd been mostly around like fellow, mostly white Southern evangelical Protestants. At the medical school in our Christian community, I mean, there were folks from East Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, from North Africa, from Europe, and they represented not only Protestants but Catholics and Orthodox and other things. And we were kind of thrown together in some ways. What does it mean to live faithfully as Christians in the world of healthcare? And there was a mentor that was here in Boston at the time who kind of worked with us as kind of a campus minister, who encouraged me to ask questions about what I was doing in the world of medicine. So I came to medical school thinking that to be a Christian in medicine meant to think about abortion and euthanasia and ethical topics. But he encouraged me to ask like bigger questions, like what is health? And what does it mean to approach death? And what does it mean to think about suffering? And why is all of this stuff around us anyway? So I was in the middle of the Longwood medical area, where the main campus of the medical school is, but also here at Mass General, and began to ask, like, why do people invest in all of this medical infrastructure all around? Like, there's this huge city, basically, there's just academic medical centers. What's all this for? And I began to realize that I could understand the biomedical science that I was learning, but medical school itself was not going to give me those kinds of answers. It wasn't going to give me those answers as a Christian, but it wasn't really going to give me those kind of answers at all. Because one thing that medicine does pretty well is to address the how questions, like how do we keep the body functioning in certain ways, but it doesn't so much address the why questions, like why do we do what we do? And what does it mean to live well? What does it mean to die well? What does it mean to accompany those who are suffering? So that got me interested in digging more deeply into my own faith. I was always a Christian. I was going to church, but I wanted to know more. And through a complicated path, I ended up leaving medical school for a couple of years and went to Duke and did a 2-year divinity degree and completed a Master of Theological Studies. And whereas at the time it felt kind of risky to do that, like I wasn't sure what I was doing by leaving medical school and studying theology, but it was a life-changing experience for me. And the best way that I can describe it is when I first came to Boston and was here for the first time ever for my medical school interview. I remember landing at Logan Airport at night. I remember getting in a cab. At that time, cabs, you got places if you didn't know to use the T. And I remember telling somebody I wanted to go to this place in Brookline where I was staying. And I remember just these like fleeting scenes. Like I remember going through a tunnel. I remember going past this large body of water. I remember a Citgo sign. I remember seeing a big dome on the other side of the body of water. I remember like night streets and it was kind of raining, but I had no idea where I was. And then I came here and I got to know the city and I biked everywhere for 4 years as a medical student. And now in looking back, I could tell you exactly where I was. This is before the Big Dig and before so beautiful down there, but I was, got into Logan Airport. I came under the old Callahan Tunnel. I was through this Starry Drive interchange. I came, down Starry Drive and then got off at Kenmore Square and then to where I was going. And that's how studying theology was for me, in that I began to see where I was in the map, so to speak, of Christian faith. I could say I grew up as a Baptist, Protestant, Christian, and this is how I fit into this larger story. And I began to realize that as a physician, I was learning a set of practices that are at most in their modern form about 200 years old. Like modern medicine has only been with us for about, 150, 200 years. But as a Christian, I got to inhabit this tradition that was 2,000 plus years old of Christians like thinking about these big questions about what does it mean to live and what does it mean to die and what does it mean to attend those who are sick. And I began to realize that was the world that I wanted to inhabit. And I began to learn how to place myself within it. And I began to learn something about the depth and beauty of that world that you all are learning here at Sattler, and that I think there's always more for us to do. And so that led me then back into the world of medicine. I came back here to finish my 4th year of medical school. I realized that I both could appreciate the beauty of healthcare and medicine more, having immersed myself in theology, but I could also see some of the things that were distorted about it. And it was that time studying theology that actually led me to be a psychiatrist. I had I had been a psychology major in college. I thought maybe that I would be maybe interested in psychiatry. And in my second and third year of medical school, this is before I left to study theology, I got kind of turned off to psychiatry because it was taught in an incredibly formulaic kind of cookie cutter way, where I learned how to, I remember going down to Mass General and to the Lindemann Mental Health Center, and I remember being taught how to do these very structured mental health interviews and how to ask patients about their symptoms and how to diagnose people according to the DSM, which is our diagnostic manual in psychiatry. And we had a test where literally the test was just reciting from memory the diagnostic criteria of the DSM for a bunch of different disorder conditions. And I remember thinking, this just doesn't feel like medicine to me. It feels like I'm just checking boxes. And I did my third year rotation, and it didn't feel like I was doing the kind of meaningful work that I wanted to do as a physician. And then I studied theology, and I began to realize how important the kind of human experiences that psychiatrists and mental health clinicians get to accompany people through are. And I began to think about all of the kind of theological questions that come up in mental health. And I began to think about, like, what does it mean to really think about people as made in the image of God in the midst of mental illness and mental health challenges, and what are the challenges we have in our mental health system? So that got me interested again in psychiatry, and I came back to medical school, and I did a rotation at Cambridge Hospital and another rotation here at Mass General, and I realized that was what I was being called to do. And so then, and I've never looked back on that. So let me just say a few things about what I think it is important about connecting the world of faith and mental health care specifically. And this is going to cover some of what's in the book Wayfaring that some of you have read, which I appreciate, and that I brought a copy for your library, so you're welcome to look at it later. But I'll say it a little bit different way. And I want to just kind of name maybe 5 dimensions of things that I think are important. And this is really meant as a setup for our conversation. The first way I think it's important to think as Christians about mental health is to move from thinking of people primarily as machines, and that can be either our bodies as complex machines or our minds as machines that need to be tweaked and fixed and optimized, all the industrial ways that we describe ourselves and our experience, and to move toward the image that I think is a more properly Christian image of human beings as wayfarers or pilgrims. So let me say just a few more things about that. All of healthcare, because of the pressures that healthcare systems are under, both to make money, but also to provide care for a lot of people, and to pressures around quality control and quality improvement, healthcare systems are always under pressure to standardize and to make things as efficient as possible. So if you wanted to design a mental health care system that operates somewhat on the model of an industrial process that's focused on efficiency and production, then how might you do that? Well, I think here's how I basically was trained as a psychiatrist, especially as a resident in psychiatry at Duke. And I still feel this myself, and I would welcome you to kind of push back on this if this is not your own experience. But I was trained when people come into my office that they have experiences that they don't want to be having, they're thinking ways they don't want to be thinking, they're feeling ways they don't want to be feeling. And I'm trained to say, oh, I know what's happening with you. You're having symptoms, which is a way of like renaming someone's experience. Like, is to say, like, you may not know how to name your experience, but I can. You're having symptoms, and the symptoms are things like decreased need for sleep, or sleeping too much, or loss of interest in pleasurable activities, or hallucinations, or loss of motivation. And then, having recognized those symptoms, I'm trained as a psychiatrist to like cluster those symptoms into diagnoses or into mental disorders. And so based on somebody having 5 of 9 symptoms over the course of a certain time period, I can diagnose someone with major depressive disorder, or with obsessive compulsive disorder, or with lots of other of the kind of diagnoses that we have in psychiatry. And then having appropriately diagnosed a disorder, I can then reach into my toolbox of medications and treatments and therapies and say, oh, I know what helps with this disorder, like take this medication or go for this kind of therapy, or there's other approaches that we can take as well. And then if the patient then leaves my office and then follows those directions and then comes back in, 3 or 4 or 5 weeks and says, Dr. Kinghorn, I'm feeling so much better, then I say, well, great, your symptoms have been reduced, you're feeling better, and the treatment is working. And if those treatments that I offer have been shown in clinical trials to separate from placebo in rigorous ways, then we can say that those are evidence-based treatments. And in that way, like the whole mental health care system can operate as a kind of process of reducing symptoms through the applications of technology in standardized ways. So we think of symptom reduction as often the kind of goal that we're looking for in mental health care, because a lot of our scientific studies and clinical trials focus on scales of symptoms, and we try to reduce those scales, and that's what we count as effective therapies. But what's missing? And I think there's a good thing in that. Like, I actually want my patients to be in less distress. I want them to, have fewer symptoms in many ways. But what's left out, if that's the primary way that we're thinking about mental health care? I think a couple of things are actually really important to consider. One is, like, does that get to the questions that people actually care most about and that are the deepest questions that bring people into mental health care to have mental health challenges? What about the deeper questions like, am I loved? And do I matter? And like, what's the goal and purpose of my life? And like, to whom do I belong? Or to what place do I belong? These are questions that you can't get at very easily if you just focus on symptoms. And they tend to sometimes get neglected in modern mental health. And the other thing I think that I'll mention more in just a minute is that I think that approach to thinking about mental health as symptom reduction often tends to lead us into thinking of mental health problems as happening in ourselves as individuals, when we actually need to be thinking not only of what's happening in our bodies, which are really important, but also what's happening in the world around us. So I'll come back to that in just a minute. So the first thing would be to move from the image of the machine to the image of human beings as pilgrims or wayfarers. And that idea of wayfarers is drawn from St. Thomas Aquinas, but also from Scripture. This idea that we are from God as God's creatures. We're on our way to God as our hope and our goal and our joy. And we find ourselves in this life on a journey from God to God. And so the question is always then, what's needed right now for the journey? Which is a different question for Christians to ask than like, how do I reduce symptoms, or how do I fix this machine that's broken? So one thing is to move from the image of the machine to the image of the wayfarer. Another would be to move from a kind of essential aloneness, essential isolation, to a model of human beings as essentially beloved. It's so easy in this world where we're so isolated from each other and where people feel so torn apart from each other to get into the idea of like of some idea that like we just happen to be thrown into this world and we better find connection and meaning however we can, because it's up to us to come up with or to create or to conjure. I think a lot of the ways that which people struggle in our culture is that deep question of like, am I, like when it comes down to it, am I ultimately alone? And is the meaning of my life something that I have to then come up with and make happen for myself? And Christian faith has a very clear answer to that, which is that the deepest truth of who we are is that God knows us and has loved us since before we were born and continues to do so at every point of our lives. And there's nothing that we can do to change that. And so for Christians in healthcare, not just mental health care, but any kind of healthcare, and frankly in the world, to live in this world as kind of witnesses to the love of God for all people and all of creation, and to know that the deepest truth of our lives is that we are known and loved by God. And there's nothing that can take that away. And how might we model that for each other? And how might that make a difference for who we are, especially in the world of mental health care, where so often people do feel alone and lonely and isolated and wonder where their hope is or where their connection is? How can we model the love of God, including by helping people to find those kinds of healthy connections that reflect who we really are, which is essentially irrevocably beloved? The third thing, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, so we need to move from the image of the machine to the image of the wayfarer. We need to move from aloneness to belovedness. We need to move from the only focusing on individuals with regard to mental health care to focusing on relationships and communities and cultures. There's a tendency in psychiatry. So I'm a psychiatrist. Some of you who may aspire to be social workers or other kinds of mental health therapists may be a little bit less prone to this. But in the field of psychiatry, we tend to see mental health problems as happening like inside individuals. So when somebody comes to me and I diagnose them with major depression or with anxiety or something, there's a tendency for me to say, like, this is your problem. And somehow something is happening inside you, inside your brain, inside your neural circuits, inside your neuroendocrine system, maybe deep inside your personality. And I work with individuals to try to find solutions. And this lends itself to what I would call the inside out view of mental health problems, which is basically the idea that when we struggle, that something's happening inside of us that's broken or not working well or dysfunctional. And treatment means like fixing that thing that's wrong on the inside of us. And that then shows up in how we live in the world and in our relationships and our communities. So like a Duke undergraduate, for example, I teach at Duke, so I see the undergraduate culture there. A Duke undergraduate who's maybe pre-med, who's taking organic chemistry and is really struggling, goes to the student counseling service and is told like, oh, like you have a disorder called generalized anxiety disorder, and take this medication or maybe accept this course of brief therapy to try to fix that problem so that then you can struggle less in your chemistry class. So that would be the inside out approach. But what if we kind of resituate the view, we kind of take the inverse view and adopt not an inside out view, but an outside in view, where we see like the center of what's wrong or the core of what's wrong, not as like specifically something that's happening inside someone, especially inside their brain, but rather in the world in which we live, in abusive or really unhealthy relationships, or in communities that have like unrealistic or unhealthy expectations for their members, or in a culture that's like polarized and fractured and where people don't trust each other. What if, especially the kind of common things that have been increasing, especially in young adults in recent years, specifically anxiety and depression, what if those have less to do with like things that are breaking on the inside as much as like we're responding to problems that are in some ways outside of us in the world in which we live? And that does show up in our bodies. It shows up in our brains. It shows up in the way that our bodies function, but it doesn't start as a problem of our bodies. So that Duke undergraduate who's struggling in organic chemistry and goes to the student counseling service might not just be told, like, there's something inside of you that's broken that you need to fix by medication or therapy or whatever. But like, what about what's happening in our community? Like, what's happening in your relationships? What's happening in the way that students and faculty like have expectations around success and performance and excellence and perfection that might be impossible for anyone to actually navigate? What's happening if we live in a culture where there's just increasing sense of aloneness and isolation? Like, that would be to take more of an outside-in approach. And maybe somebody would still benefit from therapy. Maybe somebody would still benefit from medication, but you would think differently about the root of the problem. So in other words, if the inside-out view sees mental health problems as starting on the inside and showing up in relationship and community and culture, the outside-in view would say maybe some mental health problems start by responding to what's outside of us and then show up on the inside in our experience and in our bodies. Either way, our bodies are involved and our brains are involved. This is not a kind of mind versus body or environment versus body conversation, but in some ways, the way that we struggle might be responding to things that are in the world around us, and that's going to affect the way that we think and respond. And practically, I think that both of these stories have a lot of benefits. So when I'm talking in a secular framework to residents in psychiatry at Duke, and I'm talking with them about these models, I tell them, like, tell the story of this patient using an inside-out approach, like using a kind of medical model of what something that's happening inside someone and how might we understand that, and then flip it around and tell an outside-in story and see which one fits better. And sometimes they both fit, but they lead us to think differently about that. And I think Christians can lean into that. So first, from the image of the machine to the image of the wayfarer. Second, from aloneness to belovedness. Third, from the individual to the relational. And The fourth and fifth I'll mention briefly, and then we'll be in conversation. The fourth is from focusing on control as the central good of our lives to broadening out in wonder and love and praise and Sabbath rest. So often people come into healthcare settings, and mental health care settings included, because the world has seemed and our lives seem out of control, and we want to come into clinical settings to get things under control. And that's true if you're going to see a cancer doctor. It's also true if you're coming to a psychiatrist. Something has been out of control. You want it to get under control. And that's important. Again, I want my patients to feel like their lives are under more order and control. And I work with a lot of trauma survivors in the VA setting. And those of you that are trauma survivors know that having basic control over your lives and your bodies and the circumstances around you is really important. So control is not a bad thing, but if we center our lives around keeping ourselves under control, or keeping other people under control, or keeping our world under control, then a couple of things begin to happen. One is that we begin to kind of close in on ourselves. The world becomes a kind of threat to us, a threat to our control. And we always want to be centering ourselves and kind of clamping down on that control. And that can lead us to kind of turn in on ourselves and to adopt a kind of defensive posture toward the world. And the other thing is that if we perceive that if control is our highest good, then we'll give a lot of authority to whomever or whatever has put us in that place of control. And that, I think, can be broadly applied to religious authority. It can be applied to medical authority. It can be applied to political authority or movements. But if we're turning to some kind of authority for control in a world that seems uncontrollable, that's not God, then that's pretty much the textbook biblical definition of idolatry. We find ourselves searching for control in the world and giving a lot of our allegiance to something that's not God. And I think we have to be careful of that in the world of medicine and healthcare and mental health care. So the alternative to that is to engage in healthcare and mental health care, especially with the question, am I growing in my engagement with this practice in love? Am I finding myself not closing in on myself, but opening up in love of God and in love of other people and in love of the creation all around? Am I becoming a deeper lover? And I think that's something that I think we can use as a kind of internal barometer to how are we engaging? And then the last thing I would say is to move from acquiescence to innovation. And I think this is really important for thinking about Christian faith and mental health care and healthcare broadly, but is that, the Christians didn't invent a brand new form of medicine or healthcare in the early centuries of the church. They tended to adopt the best medical practices of the world around them that they found. And we could talk more about that in the Q&A. But one thing Christians did do that has absolutely revolutionized the way that we think about the care of the sick is they would see situations where the current practices just were not good enough. They weren't faithful enough. They were dehumanizing. And Christians said, based on our faith, we can do better. So the very institution of the hospital, and this includes Mass General, it includes the Brigham, it includes BU, Boston Medical Center, all of the hospitals around us are what we would now consider charity hospitals. It doesn't mean they're free. It doesn't mean they don't have major problems with equity and access and those kinds of things, as you all know. But it does mean that if you go to if any of you right now go to the ER at Mass General, which I hope you don't have to do, and you say, I'm sick and I need care, they will not turn you away without an evaluation and without giving you what you most deeply need. And you might have to wait for it. It might not be pleasant, but you will get good care. And every hospital is like that, and partly because there's a federal law that says it has to be the case, which is itself an ethical decision to have a law like that. But hospitals treat people not just because they have social status, but because they're sick. So how did we get institutions that cared for people who are sick just because they were sick and not because they were wealthy or because they had status? Well, it's because Christians invented that institution. In the ancient Roman world and Greco-Roman world, there were institutions that cared for the sick, but they tended to be military hospitals or like infirmaries that treated people on estates. So you need to keep your workers healthy. But Christians began to, when early Christians began to form monastic communities, especially in what's now Turkey in the fourth and fifth centuries, they began to recognize that that they needed to welcome people in who were wandering and who were strangers, and they also needed to welcome people who were sick, because they saw Jesus in the face of the one who was sick, and they began to welcome people in, and they created these institutions called xenodokea, the homes of the stranger, or nosokomea, the homes of those who are diseased. And they began to care for people just because they were sick. And out of those 5th century monastery infirmaries came the institution of the hospital. So the reason why Mass General exists, the reason why all these hospitals exist, is because Christians invented that institution. Mental health care is the same way. There was a Spanish friar in the 1400s named Juan Gilberto Joffre in Valencia, Spain, who was scheduled to preach the sermon in the cathedral in Valencia on the first Sunday of Lent in February 1409. He was walking to his chapter house, and he saw a man being beaten on the streets of Valencia. And he put himself between the man and the crowd. He told the crowd to stop. He carried the man to the house where he was staying. He entrusted the man to care. And then he went to the cathedral and he preached his sermon. And he was so angry when he got there that he basically stood before the elites of Valencia. And he said, you all need to make sure that this doesn't happen in your city. And out of that, there was a group of like wealthy merchants and businessmen who got together, and they formed an institution called the Hospital for the Holy Innocents. And that became one of the first, if not the first, hospital specifically for the care of people with mental illness in the Western world. As a Christian, saying like we can do better. Or the Quakers in the late 1800s and late 1700s, early 1800s in England, who saw obviously a Christian, in a broad sense, a Christian tradition, who saw one of their own members, Hannah Mills, a young woman, dying in a very confining prison-like urban asylum in England, and said, we can do better. So they persuaded one of their own who owned a retreat, or an estate in York, to open that estate for the care of people with mental illness. And the idea was that in a rural setting where people had access to like clean food and clean water and clean air and nature, that would be a healing environment. And that institution, the York Retreat, absolutely changed the way that institutional mental health care happened, both in England and also in the United States. And the last thing I'd say, since I know there's a deep like Anabaptist roots here at Sattler, one of the amazing stories of the 20th century is that Mennonite conscientious objectors in the Second World War were sometimes assigned to large state hospitals to do their work in lieu of military service in the Second World War. And they found these state hospitals in the 1840s to be pretty dehumanizing, overcrowded, like a lot of use of restraints and confining practices. And so after the war, after their conscientious objective service had ended, they said, we can do better. And they began to form, some of you may be familiar with these centers because they still exist in some. They formed this network of Mennonite mental health centers that specifically engaged practices of discipleship and nonviolence and non-resistance and peace, to provide opportunities for people to heal in a way that made minimal use of restraint and coercion. And again, it's like these Christians saying like, we see what's around us and we can do better. So my question to all of you, those of you that are headed into healthcare and mental health care, and also those of you that are not, but are engaged in the world of healthcare, like what do we see around us right now as Christians, and how might we be called to do better? So with that, I look forward to conversation. So thank you all.
We on? Good. Thank you, Dr. Kinghorn. That was super insightful. You mentioned, we're going to go into talk about Aquinas a little bit. You mentioned the modern machine metaphor, which you talk about in your book, as well as Aquinas and his model of personhood. Can you elaborate on the connection between Aquinas and modern mental health and how you found that connection? And what is Aquinas' model of personhood versus the modern machine metaphor?
Yeah. So thanks. This is always a great question in, like at Duke, is like, why would you write a book on mental health that draws from a 13th century theologian, philosopher, well before the rise of modern medicine and modern science. And so the book that I've written has the central figure of St. Thomas Aquinas as an authority. So why is St. Thomas Aquinas? Well, he was a pretty remarkable figure. I'm guessing that few, if any of you in the room are Catholic, but we often think of him as a Catholic theologian because the Roman Catholic Church has drawn so much on his work, but he was a theologian of the undivided Western Church. He wrote before the Protestant Reformation. And so in some ways his thought is, I think it can be accessible to Protestants too. But Aquinas was a pretty remarkable figure. He was someone who was kind of had this interesting story early in his life where he kind of rebelled in some ways against his wealthy family, and instead of seeking the relative stability of living in a Benedictine monastery as the non-eldest son, that would have been the kind of path of social respect, he joined this kind of renegade group of wandering preachers that we now know as the Dominican order, the order of preachers. And basically the idea was that they would just go from city to city and they would ask for alms and they would live in community and they would preach the gospel. And his family didn't like that, but that was who St. Thomas was. In his case, he spent most of his life like in different European cities teaching. He was basically a university professor in the medieval sense of that term. But he lived at a time in the Middle Ages when, I know some of you probably are deeply familiar with this history, where the thought of Aristotle, which had been kind of quasi-forgotten in the Latin-speaking West, was being rediscovered and was kind of being synthesized and brought into conversation with Christian theology again. And Aristotle, his texts had been preserved in more the Arabic-speaking East and it got retranslated into the West. And Aquinas was living in this time. And at the time, it was very unclear whether Aristotle was a friend or foe to Orthodox Christian faith, because some of the things that Aristotle obviously a pagan philosopher, some things he said were just not consistent with biblical truth. And Aquinas, though, had a way of synthesizing, of taking what he understood as the best insights of Aristotle and synthesizing with the deepest truths of Orthodox Christian faith. And one of the things that Aristotle taught Aquinas through his teacher, Albert the Great, was to be very attentive to the details of the natural world. So Aquinas was not himself a physician or a scientist, but he had this deep appreciation for a close attention to the materiality of things, for plants and animals and for the human being. And so he began to write about the human person in a way that's incredibly attentive and detail oriented about our bodies, about our minds, and also about our emotions. He wrote a treatise on emotion that was the most detailed investigation of emotion that anyone to that point had done in the Latin-speaking world. And so And he brought all of that into this deep theological vision of what it means to be human. So in his best-known work, the Summa Theologiae, which some of you have encountered, I'm sure, he basically tells this broad story of all of creation, of God, first of all, God, and then all of the creation, including human beings, as coming from God, as our creator. And then humans as wayfarers, or in Latin, viators, wayfarers, on the way back to God as our end. And so humans are on the way, and Jesus Christ is the way. So, we're from God, we're on our way to God, and Jesus is the way. And of course, it's more complicated than that, but that's the big sweep of his vision. And so for me now, as a psychiatrist in the modern 20th century, where we sometimes have a hard time thinking about how do we integrate our psychological theories and our biological understandings of human being into a theological vision, Aquinas is a kind of mentor for that in some ways. He gives us this big vision that he also demonstrates how you can then integrate human psychology into this larger theological vision of human creatures. So I could say more about that, but that's why Aquinas, and why I'd encourage you, if you have a chance to lean into Aquinas' work, you'd find it fruitful, I think.
Thank you. I think to move in a more practical direction with that, the idea of moving away from the machine metaphor into seeing people as wayfarers. When you're in the room with someone as a practitioner, or when any of us are in the room with someone as a friend who's going through something difficult, how does your interaction with them differ from someone operating out of a machine metaphor in working with someone?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think partly my answer is going to be kind of kind of simple because I think it's sometimes the simple human things that are the most important. So rather than jumping, if it's a patient, rather than jumping like immediately into questions about someone's symptoms, like how much are you sleeping, how much are you eating, what's your rating on this depression rating scale, I just stop first of all when somebody comes into my office, and I treat mostly kind of middle-aged to older veterans, many of whom come a long way to see me, and I just say, I'm so glad to see you. Like, it's so good that you're here, and it's really good to see you, and just stop for even like 1 second and allow that to be present in truth to the person. And then to say something on the order of like, tell me how things are going, or, tell me how you're doing. And then to stop and listen. So I hope psychiatrists are better, but most physicians, this has been studied, take 17 seconds before they interrupt their patients at the beginning of an encounter. So I try to take several times more than that, maybe, 10 or 20 times more than that, to like, just let the patient talk and to be attentive to story over symptoms. And so it doesn't take, I have typically 30 minutes to see patients, which feels too short sometimes, but it's a generous amount of time relative to what a lot of psychiatrists in private practice do. But I try to take the first 5 or 10 minutes or so of a patient encounter just to try to understand the patient and their own stories. And it might be things like, tell me how things have been going, tell me what your sources of stress are, catch me up on these things that you had said that you were hoping to do between last time I saw you and now. But just to try to center stories. And then we get to the symptom questions, in part because I have to, and in part because they're relevant for treatment. But I try to never let people feel like they're just a collection of symptoms for me. So.
Thank you. A few of us a good portion of us are from conservative Christian backgrounds, and there's often a lot of skepticism around mental health care and modern clinical health care. In your book, you claim that even though we can learn from the thought of Aquinas, you wouldn't want to be without modern therapies. Why? The church has functioned for generations without these modern therapies. Why are they helpful for us today?
Yeah, so I think there's a question of like, why are the modern psychotherapies useful at all for the church? Like, why do we need them? I think I think it's important not to think of the kind of modern psychotherapies that are most in use now: cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. Like, on one hand, it's easy to kind of have this kind of quasi mystical view of them, but I would encourage you to think of them as just like practical skills that clinicians have learned that seem to be helpful for certain people at certain points in time. And so I think the role for any therapist is just to think about what kind of practical wisdom and skills have I acquired in the course of my training that can be helpful in this case. So I think I want to kind of demystify therapy a little bit. I think so a couple ways to answer that question. Like, if the church has gone on without these therapies for so long, why now? One is to say that sometimes the modern psychotherapies can actually help to reclaim some wisdom that has been part of maybe human experience broadly, but the church's experience of pastoral care and pastoral counseling, but is easy to forget. And so, there's certain things about cognitive behavior therapy that, for example, that are just kind of very practical. Like, what's the connection between your activities and your life, and how you organize your time, and the kind of thoughts that you bring in, that many Christians have found appealing. And I think also, I would say that the best way that I can understand who I am as a psychiatrist is not that I am a prescriber, or that, I'm trained in a very specific mode of therapy and that's what I do, but just that I'm inhabiting a tradition that, like I said earlier, is not that old. Maybe in the case of modern psychiatry, more like 150 years old at most. That where a lot of people, most not Christians, but some Christians, have like sat with people who are suffering and struggling and tried their best to figure out how to help them. And there's been some things that I wouldn't want to claim from that tradition, but there's a lot of things that I would claim, because I think there's some wisdom that comes just from learning from people who over many decades and generations have been just trying to help people who are distressed. So I want to learn from that. And I think the church can learn from that. And the fact that the church got along without the modern psychotherapies for a long time doesn't mean that people who were struggling necessarily got the help and support and care that they needed. And so I think there's ways in which the church can learn from some of the some of the practices that are there now. At the same time, I do think it's really important to go into the modern psychotherapies eyes wide open about their metaphysical and even theological underpinnings. And I think that we should be aware of that. So, for example, dialectical behavior therapy, which I think is clearly empirically a very effective mode of therapy for borderline personality disorder, but also for really emotional dysregulation more broadly. If any of you are in DBT or have experience with DBT, I would, certainly not discourage that. I would encourage that. It's important to note that Marsha Linehan had this it came in some ways out of Marsha Linehan's own spiritual experience. Some of you know the story. She was the founder of DBT. She grew up Catholic. She was really, had long hospitalizations as an adolescent, had an experience praying in a Catholic retreat center chapel in the Chicago area of kind of just acceptance of God for her and for her life. And that changed her life, and it led her into to found dialectical behavior therapy. But she did it also through training with in the Pacific Northwest with a Benedictine Catholic monk who was also a Zen priest. And there's a lot of Zen Buddhism in DBT. So you just have to, so as Christians think about that, it's kind of a question of how can we draw from these practices, recognizing that they're not our own, you might, so to speak, indigenous practices for our own faith. Same with acceptance and commitment therapy. It's an incredibly effective therapy for a lot of different conditions. I have Christian colleagues who think it's there's a guy named Joshua Knabb, who's a psychologist in California Baptist University, who's written a whole book on acceptance and commitment therapy from a Christian perspective. And he thinks that it fits really well to a Christian worldview. But ACT in its origin came out of this pretty radical atheistic behaviorist framework. So I just think Christians need to be just aware of what are we importing into our care practices. So that's not to refute any of it, just say eyes wide open for how we think about it.
Sure. That's super helpful. So then kind of in this same line, I think a lot of Christians and conservative Christians, kind of Christians in general, struggle with that. What is spiritual? What is physical? Is it something broken in my brain? Is it a spiritual thing? So can you speak to what is the role of spiritual oppression in mental illness? And on the converse of that, what is the role of the Holy Spirit in mental health healing?
Yeah. Thanks for these really simple, easy questions. It's yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a few ways to maybe begin to address that. And I think we could spend a year talking about all parts of that. One is that one way to interpret that question is how do we distinguish those parts of us that are spiritual from those parts of us that are physical and psychological? And I want to resist, and I realize somebody may disagree with this. I don't want to contradict anything you're learning here at Sattler, but I would say I want to resist the kind of compartmentalization of human beings into different domains. So as if we have a physical part of ourselves and then an emotional part and then a social part and then a spiritual part, because I just don't think that's how we're created. I think we're created as ensouled bodies who are always material and in relationship with other bodies and with the earth and with the broader creation, and always in that open to the movement of God's Spirit and to the presence of God. So every part of ourselves, including the most basic bodily parts of ourselves, has a kind of spiritual dimension, because we never live alien to or isolated from the sustaining presence of God. So, when I take communion, and I realize we have probably different theologies of communion here, but when I take communion, is that a physical act? Well, yes. Is it a spiritual act? Well, yes. Is it a social act? Well, yes. It's all together. And I think I want to resist compartmentalization. So that's one way. I would have a more integrated view. That Andy Crouch, in his recent book on technology, he talks about humans as heart, soul, mind, strength complexes designed for love. And I just think that's a nice, simple description of who we are as human beings. I think the question though of how do we think about specifically how psychological struggle or personal struggle might relate from specifically forms of oppression from in the spiritual world, and it gets to the question about the principalities and powers of the air and demonic spirits and other things. I want to be careful in how I say that, because I'm not personally trained in practices of exorcism or the kind of discernments that would lead to exorcism to make judgments, except that I would say as a Christian, I do believe, because the New Testament attests to them and because the church has attested to their reality over time, I do believe in the existence and presence of demons and unclean spirits in the world of the demonic. And I think that kind of discernment is really important. There is a book that I've read part of that you can look at by a psychiatrist named Richard Gallagher. He's a Catholic psychiatrist who writes a book about the demonic, and he does kind of write in careful ways how he engages as a psychiatrist in evaluation of people to help to discern, like, is this psychotic illness or is this demon oppression or possession? I've not done that myself, so I don't want to claim to have done that. I would say it's important when we think about the demonic, and I say this as like affirming the reality of demons. Like, how do they typically function, especially in the New Testament and especially in the Synoptic Gospels, where we have the most like descriptions of Jesus' own encounter with the demons? I think one is that we tend to inherit, in part from a kind of medieval imagery, like Dante and others, this idea of like the demons as these like little kind of almost human-like spirits that kind of creep into people and possess people. And I don't want to deny that possibility, but there's a broader sense in the first century world where it was just presumed that the world was just pervaded with spiritual forces of various sorts. Like, so to breathe, literally, I mean, the word for spirit is literally breath. So to breathe is to breathe in these like spirits that infuse us, and some are oriented toward good and toward God, and some are not. And so the idea that like struggle could be caused by people being inhabited or oppressed by these unclean spirits or demons would not have been something that people would have really resisted. It would have been just like assumed. It's part of the assumptive world. And so how did the demons and unclean spirits function specifically? Well, they tended not to, in the New Testament descriptions, for whatever reason, I can't give you a why for this, but they tend not to be seen as afflicting people that are already in important positions of power and privilege. They tend to afflict people who are already at the margins somehow. Kids, women, people with disabilities, people who are already ill, and they tend to then take people who are already in some ways vulnerable and to make them more vulnerable. So they push people into positions of, like, modern speak would be like compounded vulnerability. They're at the margins of the margins. And so for Jesus to go to those who are oppressed and afflicted by demons and to declare his power over the demons is not only to declare his lordship among all authorities in heaven on earth, but specifically to go to the margins of the margins to rescue people from oppression, which is keeping them from human community and from community with God. And so I think there's a way in which, like, thinking about the demonic is like, how might we recognize what are those like spiritual forces that seem to be taking people who are vulnerable and making them even more vulnerable, and how in the power of the Holy Spirit might we seek to be agents of resistance to that. And so that's a kind of broad way of thinking that I would say. I think it's for the Holy Spirit. Like, I mean, we believe as Christians that we are, the Holy Spirit is the Lord and giver of life. And so we are constantly held in existence by God's sustaining power. And Holy Spirit, is the person of the Trinity who, like, links us and unites us into the person of the Son, that we can then regard the Father as Abba, Father, as the Son does. And so, like, to kind of see the Spirit always as like seeking in some ways both to attest to Christ, but also to bring us as baptized Christians into the person of the Son is really, really important for us.
Thank you for answering that question well. This is the last question we have, and then we'll move to the audience Q&A. In the context of Sattler, what advice do you have on human flourishing? How do we create a place that attends well to each other's mental health?
Great question. Yeah. That's, you all know that better than I do. I would say I can't speak for Sattler because this is my first day here, although I really love being here. That I can speak for Duke and for other universities that I've been a part of, including Harvard. I think one of the things that I would do is to say, like, what do we most deeply need as human beings, apart from where we attend school or if we attend school? And like one way to think in a psychological frame, drawing on my friend Kurt Thompson, who draws from Dan Siegel about this, these 4 S's that we, as human beings, we need to be safe, meaning we need to be like, have those around us who can help to protect us, but not to overprotect us. So safety is a relative thing. We need to be seen. So Kurt says we come into this world looking for someone looking for us. Like, how can we have communities where we see each other and are seen, not in unsafe, unhealthy ways, but in healthy ways? We need to be soothed. And so when we're in distress, we need others around us who can say, hey, like, I want to help you through this. Just like a parent would soothe we have a few small kids in the room, like you all know well, like when a small child is distressed, like the parent or caregiver is able to soothe that distress, not to protect the child forever, but to be able to say, it's going to be okay, and I'm going to help you navigate this challenge. And then all of that allows us to be secure, meaning to be those that, knowing that we're safe and seen and soothed, have a way then to have a kind of security to not only be able to kind of find those connections when we need them, but to be able to take risks and to do important and courageous things. So you all aren't here at Sattler to stay here forever. You're here because you are drawn to this place in order to be able to serve God in various transformative ways out in the world. But how can you develop the kind of security of attachments with each other and with God that then allows for that courageous future to happen? I think that's critical. And then the inverse of that, I think, is being attentive to the dynamics of shame. My experience in universities is that shame is this like unseen, omnipresent phenomenon that universities use as like fuel and lubricant to like keep universities going. But shame operates, and again, I'm not talking about Sattler, but I am talking about Duke, where shame. One way to think about shame, and one way that shame operates. I'm not against shame. I wish in our world that some people may have more shame than they do, but one way that shame operates is that it corresponds with a kind of 2-part belief. One part is that I am not blank enough, where that blank is whatever we believe is important to be accepted and included within a community in which we really need to belong. So at a place like Duke or Harvard, where I've been, it could be like I'm not smart enough, or I'm not well read enough, or I'm not good looking enough, or I'm not social enough, or I'm not quick enough on my feet, or I'm not whatever. In a theological setting, it could be I'm not orthodox enough, or I'm not whatever. And the second part of that is that when other people realize the truth that I am not blank enough, I will no longer be welcome among this community. I'll be ostracized, which taps into our deep-seated fear of being alone. And so then we feel this like deep sense of shame that we're at risk of being ostracized, which then leads us to do things like drawing on ourselves, to hide from other people, to sometimes to like just kind of deflect blame elsewhere and to kind of blame other things. It can lead us to do things to numb our experience that in ways that I think when college students sometimes get into trouble through various risky activities, it's sometimes to just numb those feelings of shame. Or my own personal favorite way of coping with shame, which is to be like, I'm just going to work harder and just prove that I do belong here and that I'm enough. And you can do that for a long time, and it can work for a long time until it doesn't work anymore, until you get like to some point in your education or career and all of a sudden everything falls apart because you've just been trying to outrun shame and you can't ultimately do that. The only cure for shame is to take the risk that in our self-ascribed faults, and that we can be vulnerable and still be loved and still make a way through. And so I think if we could just be aware of how shame shows up in educational settings, and I would just challenge you, if you're in a setting where like well-intentioned people are treating each other terribly, like think about what's the ecology of shame in that system. And often you'll see shame working in this kind of unnamed ways. And so if we want to think about college, student, and university flourishing in mental health, like how can we think about healthy ways of addressing our own shame and navigating shame in a system as a whole?
Safe, seen, soothed, and secure.
Right.
Got it. Beautiful.
It's not original to me, but I'll use it.
We'll take it. Yeah. We're going to move to audience Q&A. If you ask a question, just introduce yourself, your name, where you're at in Sattler, or if you're a faculty, what your role is.
Hi, I'm Phoenix. I'm a second year human biology student here at Sattler. So when you use an outside-in approach as opposed to an inside-out approach, what do you do with the stories you learn? What if there are things you don't have control over?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what about when psychological and mental health challenges have to do with things on the outside that you can't control? I think that's a great question, because that's the reality much, if not most of the time in my experience. And I think there's a grace and a goodness to simply being able to tell the truth that actually is often really welcome. And so in psychiatry, we can sometimes get into this trap where, and I don't mean just a trap for psychiatrists, but a trap for patients too, where we can say, somebody comes to us, say with chronic depression, and the depression is in the context of a lot of loss and a lot of maybe significant health problems or housing or other things that no like clinical encounter can fix immediately. But the person's feeling depressed, and they've been to different psychiatrists, and they keep feeling depressed, and they keep getting prescribed medications to make them less depressed, but the medications aren't working. So they end up being on higher doses of medication or on more medication. And then there's a sense of a sense of futility of like, well, the medications aren't working. The psychiatrist must not be working. I must need to find somebody else. And that can lead to a kind of hopelessness, I think, on the part of both clinicians and also patients. I think being able to step back and to be like, well, maybe the reason these medications aren't resulting in the kind of change we want is because you're facing some really significant challenges in your life. And we may not be able to change those immediately, but we can at least name the truth of them, and to name that maybe the thing to do isn't to keep increasing doses of medication, but to think about what are medications that could be helpful, but then what are opportunities to work on either addressing these challenges or finding support within them. And that kind of reframing isn't always helpful, but it can be incredibly helpful. So I think starting with just being able to tell the truth. And then I think also, like I have colleagues at Duke, we have internal arguments with each other, because I have some colleagues who basically believe that, get worried that physicians can kind of claim authority over everything, and so that physicians should be focusing on the health of the patient and not on larger systemic social issues. I think my own view is that, yes, as a psychiatrist, I'm not a policy expert. I'm not a lawyer. I'm definitely not a politician. There's a lot of things that I don't know about how to organize our systems, but I am a witness. And so how can we not only work with our patients around broader structural issues, but also witness to the realities of how they're showing up in our communities and culture? So to be able to name the fact that, like, you know, I know it's even worse in Boston, but like rapidly escalating rents in the central North Carolina where I live has led a lot of people to be economically insecure and at risk of eviction. And that's driving rates of anxiety and depression. And I can't fix that, because I'm not sure anybody can, but I can at least witness to it. And so just being able to tell the truth both to ourselves and to our patients, but also more broadly, is important.
I want to tie my question to a little bit of the question beforehand. What is our role as a church? So you talk about seeing inside out. So that means that it seems that there is a lot of things covered that we can do. That, what would be your advice for the church to be doing as a mental health worker who really cares for the people around you?
Yeah. So what is the role of the church? I think it's a great question. I was saying this to a couple of you before. I heard a Christian psychologist at Biola University a few weeks ago named Chris Adams, who does work on clergy health and well-being. And he made this comment in a presentation. He said, like churches, when they are working as they should, actually offer and provide everything that human beings most deeply need. Like what's one basic human need that the church isn't in some ways like equipped to provide when churches are working well? So, those 4 S's, to be safe, seen, soothed, and secure, connection, meaning, vocation, connection to God, material support, like all the things that we need as human beings. It just so happens that God has commissioned the church to provide in some ways. That doesn't mean that the church can do it alone, but like, so what does it mean to think about the church in terms of meeting this? Like, what do we most deeply need as human beings? How do we do that? I think with respect to mental health, I do think that there's a real role for churches to, well, so there's in a broad sense, like we all struggle, like all of us, even if we've never seen a therapist or have never had something that was diagnosed as a mental health problem, we all have challenges in our lives. So how can our churches be places where we are seen and known, where we have other people that can help us to walk through that? And those can be issues around like navigating relationships, navigating our spiritual challenges, all sorts of things. And so churches need to be equipped to be able to provide that kind of just like companionship and mutual encouragement and support. I think when there's issues that are more complicated, that require a more kind of a deeper set of skills to be able to address, then I think the question is like, who's best equipped to be able to navigate that? And I think, pastors who have some, depending on the church and depending on the person, who have some training and counseling and experience with walking with people can do a lot. So I think the pastors can play a really important role in counseling and in equipping and being connected to the church. But there's always going to be a threshold at which like a need that somebody's experiencing or that a family's experiencing is more than anyone in the church isn't equipped as a professional is going to feel like they're not. It gets to like, I'm not sure I know what to do here. And that's where I think like that, thinking about what does it mean to have healthcare professionals, including mental health therapists and counselors and psychiatrists, who understand their work to be in some ways in service of the church, who can be available to be able to see people who are really struggling and need the kind of particular kinds of wisdom that clinicians can provide. So I think it's important for those of you that are going to be Christian clinicians to think about how can you think about your work as in service of the church and to be available. And it's important for those of you in churches to think about like who are trusted clinicians, especially therapists and counselors and others who you can build relationships with that then you can send people to when they really need additional support. So that's one way to, does that get to some of your question? Yeah. Thank you.
I'm Professor of Biology. So I guess one theory I currently have is that the preceding generation and generations have overemphasized the intellectual aspect of Christianity, of having correct theology, etc.
Yeah.
Good apologetics, that alley. And we've done it to the neglect of the emotional aspect. And the rising generation is trying to correct that, and rightfully so. But most humans, they may tend to overcorrect that. What litmus tests, what strategies, would you propose to gauge whether someone who is emphasizing a strong emotional aspect of their Christianity is still orthodox? What are the pitfalls that you sort of see coming down the road?
Yeah, quick. Thanks, Dr. Bennett. Yeah, thank you. Well, I do think that there's certain. So I'm myself Presbyterian, so I'm in a kind of Reformed Christian context, which is kind of over like kind of sinner number one in terms of like overemphasizing intellect and belief, maybe as opposed to the emotional life or the bodily life as well. And Christian faith, it's just like I said before, like we're not divided into intellectual and physical and spiritual parts. Like we're all of a piece. And so how do we worship God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength? And that requires not only it is important what we believe, because what we believe helps to norm the rest of our experience, and what we confess certainly is deeply important. But it's also like, what do we do with our bodies? How do we engage with beauty? How do we think about our emotional lives? How does that connect with each other? And so I would say it all has to be a part of a piece. And so if we think about Christian faith as just like believing the right things without attention to what we're doing with our bodies, we're going to get kind of disembodied and too theoretical, and that's not going to meet people's heart needs. But if we just focus on like creating the kind of experience that people feel like, oh, this is a great experience, then we're going to end up getting sucked into a kind of market capitalism, kind of spiritual capitalism in some ways, where it's like whoever can create the best experience on a Sunday morning to attract people and get, bottoms and seats, that's a marker of faithfulness. And of course, that's not true either. And so churches can get deeply misguided in those ways. So I think it's kind of all the above, and I think some of the churches, some of the ways in which, so again, I recognize there's a lot of denominational diversity here. I don't mean to declare things about anyone's particular tradition, but in my Presbyterian church, about 10 years ago, we started doing weekly communion in my Presbyterian church, which is more what, Anglicans and Episcopalians and Catholics would do, but it's become a deeply important part of our life together, in part because it's a time where like there's the preaching of the word, which is always important in a Reformed Presbyterian context. And then there's the reception of the sacrament in ways that allows it to be just clear that the body is gathered. So we pray for each other as people are going out to receive communion. It's a tangible thing that we do. And so that to me has been really deeply meaningful. So how can we, even if you all are in traditions where you're not like liturgically committed to the Book of Common Prayer or the Great Thanksgiving or other things, how can we learn from the church's liturgy over time as a kind of guide for our life together and our prayer, and see it as a resource for us and a gift and an offering for us that Christians have kind of have in some ways like bequeathed to us for us to be blessed by. So, yeah.
I'm Jude Schaefer, first year freshman in bio, and I was wondering what you would like to see in education, because I have a lot of years ahead of me if I'm going to be a medical doctor. So looking at the difference between medical doctor or osteopathics, like a more well-rounded, could you speak on that? And like, if you are to be someone who makes a big difference in the world of medicine, looking outside in, what should education look like?
Yeah, great question. Well, I'm not a DO, and I don't have any experience teaching in osteopathic medical contexts. It is a perfectly legitimate pathway to becoming a physician. So to think about DO programs, one of there are some background to DO work that kind of are rooted in A.T. Still, who was the founder of osteopathic medicine, was the son of a Methodist minister, had these kind of like Christian adjacent spiritual beliefs about like treating people holistically that I think Christians can claim in some ways. And one of the things that DO programs often do well is they do focus on a holistic view, but they also focus on community healthcare. They're not as focused on big academic medical centers like the ones here in Boston, but they tend to like focus on doing work in community hospitals and those kinds of things for lots of reasons. So I would say that's just a question of discernment. Like with whom do you want to be trained? How do you want to think about your experience is important. I think if you're going to become a physician, so either in the US an MD or a DO, I think it's less important. That particular degree is less important than the question of like, how do you not think of your education and your career as just like basically that you're your own kind of entrepreneur product and you're having to invest in yourself, but rather like, how do you find yourself drawn into stories that are bigger than you are, so that you can then both claim your own story, like what is it that led you in your life so far, which probably connects to your faith since you're here at Sattler, and what is it that drew you to Sattler and is drawing you into medicine? Like what stories do you carry with you? And you might have complex ways of navigating that. What stories are already operating in the communities where you're working as a physician? And so like when I came here to Boston, it was really important to me actually to learn the history of the city of Boston, which I didn't know much about. And I began to learn about, especially Boston's racial history, that really helped me to work in the hospitals here as people would come from different communities. And I was getting to see like how complex this place is. And to work wherever you are, to learn to love the place and the people where you are and their stories and their joys and their struggles and their wounds. And to do that everywhere you are. And then to think about like whose story, to whom are you called, to serve? And how do you understand yourself as serving a particular people or a particular community. That could be a geographic community, or it could be a religious community, or, depending, a lot of different options. But like, whose flourishing do you desire such that in some ways your flourishing as a physician is tied up with their flourishing? And find yourself drawn into stories that are bigger than you are. And that's a way to avoid some of the like very self-focused, like career optimization that you can see as a tendency in medical school, especially.
My name is Joshua. I'm a business major. So my question is, how do you honor emotions without idolizing them, people's and yourself?
Yeah, how do you honor emotions without idolizing them? Great question. I'll give you St. Thomas Aquinas' answer, which is that he saw emotions as in some ways signposts that give us information about whom or what we love. So he saw emotions as always tied to love. And I have a chapter in my book where I talk about this in detail. It's a complicated system, but basically he believes that like as human beings, we are always lovers, and we are always drawn toward people and things that we believe like that we want to be united to, and that we believe will like broaden us and give us life. And when we find ourselves like, and so our desire, our longing is partly a longing to be united to particular people or things or ideas, or it could be a lot of different things. And when we're united to those things, we feel delight and joy, we feel like positive emotions. And when we experience negative emotions, then that's often a sign that something is getting in the way of what we love or what we or think we love. And so it's important when we have unwanted emotional experience. So very, very few patients come to me as a psychiatrist and they're like, I just have been feeling great recently and I want to understand that more. Like, that's not why people show up to see me. Like they come because they're feeling negative emotions. And so that's often anxiety, fear, anger, depression, other things. And so how do I work with them to think like, what is your experience? I have to say, not just as this unwanted thing that you want to get rid of, but like, if you're feeling anxious, like what is it that you love that you're perceiving to be blocked or to be at risk, that can help you to make sense of this experience of anxiety? Or if you're feeling depressed, for Aquinas, what is it that's like continually kind of weighing on you that you really just don't feel like you can get rid of, and yet you long to be free of? And so that's a way of helping to frame our emotional experiences, in some way signposts for the way that we are oriented in our lives as lovers. And I think that's one way to keep the emotions themselves from being like the very center of our lives. And we think about like, to whom are we drawn? What are we drawn to? That's an overly simplistic question to a really complicated. I mean, like it's never that simple in a clinical setting. So I don't want to reduce it to just like a little thing like that. But I think that's one way to think about it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Kinghorn, for all your time.
Thank you all so much.